Let's go ahead. Let's get started. We can talk about, so this one wasn't planned, and certainly want to take some time to talk about how Isiah and Jordan, so those last two episodes of The Last Dance have sort of reignited the beef, per se, between Michael Jordan and Dennis Rodman. And everybody's paying attention to this and everybody is focused on this. So I certainly want to take some time to talk about it. And personally, I guess my take may be a little bit different because I know it means ratings when we focus on the differences and the things that ignite the beef, per se. But the reality is these players are actually more similar than what we realize or what they get credit for. So I certainly want to talk about the similarities of these players and, of course, in that talk about the great Isiah Thomas. So first off, I like to talk about with Isiah is people should know just how great of a player Isiah really is. And he should certainly get that credit that he deserves because he is probably in that top 15, top 20 conversations of players that have ever played in the league. And one, that's an amazing accomplishment for anybody, but it's certainly an amazing accomplishment when you're talking about a player that's 6 feet tall, that's able to impact the game, impact his team, and do all the things that he did at that size. And people should certainly, we talk about the Iversons, we talk about the Currys, we talk about those players, the Chris Pauls, the Steve Nashes, but Isiah certainly should be in that conversation of those top 20 players that ever played. And he's one of the few players in NBA history that averaged over 13 assists a game in one season, an incredible feat. And this is also a player that was a dynamic scorer, and that was made evident even throughout the biggest platform where he showed his scoring ability is when they actually played the Lakers in the finals and lost, and he turned his ankle really bad, and he had like 43 points on a severely sprained ankle. And amazing performance. He's hobbling down the floor basically on one leg. So shout out to Isiah Thomas for being the all-time great. And also, the other thing that he should probably get credit for is he is part of the reason why we have this guy over my shoulder, Michael Jordan, and the greatness that Michael sort of ascended to is because he had to overcome that challenge of Isiah. So Isiah should certainly get a lot more credit for being the great player that he is. So let's talk about the beef, per se, and how it started. And, I know a lot of people talk about the physical play, and there's a lot of attention put on those playoff series that they played in that shaped the rule changes that we see in the NBA now, with it being less physical, less contact, etc. Actually, a lot of people think that the beef actually started in 1985 in Michael Jordan's first All-Star game, where Michael was under the assumption that some of the All-Stars, and you can debate whether this is true or not, but some of the All-Stars, led by Isiah, were literally trying to embarrass Michael in his first All-Star game and, using a basketball term, freeze him out, meaning don't pass him the ball, look him off. And, again, it's debatable whether that's true or not, but Michael certainly felt that way. And so that's where it sort of started. And, to go behind the curtain and get a glimpse of these uber competitive players, these great players that do the things that they've done on the floor or in any other sport, part of their makeup is once they perceive that you are trying to wrong them, there's no coming back from that. And so Michael held on to that, and that permeated their sort of matchups when they met in the playoffs. Also, too, before the quote unquote Jordan rules were instituted by Detroit, Michael had some very successful regular season games against the Pistons where he scored over 50. Another one, it was 49. So he had a lot of success as well. One, being the great player that he is, and then two, probably taking out some of that anger against Isiah Thomas for freezing him out in the All-Star game. He probably took some of that out on the floor on Isiah before the Jordan rules were instituted. And they had these physical matchups in the playoffs. So, as I said, I certainly want to talk about that. And I know that sports sort of evokes emotion. And because it evokes emotion, it sort of forces us to take a side in this. And my premise is I love this game so much that I appreciate the greatness. So we should actually appreciate the greatness of both of these players because they competed and rose to the ultimate level of this sport and were part of the reason why this sport has become the phenomenon that it's become. So we should certainly appreciate their greatness and not always make it about if you're a Jordan guy, you can't be an Isiah Thomas guy or vice versa. So, but again, when you're starting that beef, it again started during that 85 season. And let's talk about some of those similarities that sort of unite these guys. And, we always hear about when two people are in a relationship or two people are friends and they are just alike. That relationship can be incredible or it can also be volatile. And for these two players, it was very volatile. Of course, just by the definition of them being on two different teams, you're going to have some volatility there. And then the fact that they were just alike, I think, made them like oil and water. So let's go back to the branding. Again, in the 80s, as basketball was becoming this pop culture icon that it is now, branding was very important. So you have in Michael Jordan and Isiah Thomas, these players that have what we term as $1 million smiles, right? Like their smiles can light up a room. So much so that the league got behind their smiles and put a persona behind their smiles in their public personas, making them look like quote unquote choir boys. And companies got behind that as well. Obviously Nike with Air Jordan, and then Converse had a presence with Mark Aguirre, who was Isiah's teammate in Detroit and childhood friend and from Chicago. Mark Aguirre, Isiah, Magic, Bird, etc. all wore a Converse shoe called the Weapon. And they were branding Isiah's smile and Isiah's look as a player that looked like a little innocent young boy in a league full of behemoths in terms of height and size. But behind that smile for both of those players, they were fierce competitors, very fierce competitors. And so much so that intimidation was part of both of their personas from a basketball perspective. They both use intimidation and fear to catapult them to success. So another thing that united them. So with that fear and intimidation, Michael sometimes turned that fear and intimidation. It was an internal force, using it to motivate his teammates. And Detroit and Isiah Thomas being the leader of that persona, that bad boys persona that Detroit conveyed, Isiah used his fear and intimidation to intimidate the opposition. So even though one did it internally and the other one did it externally, they both actually relied on fear and intimidation to achieve the results that they both got as players. So that's another thing that really united them. And this is about their personalities. And the other thing, too, when you start looking at their dispositions, you have these guys, that's a uniting factor between the two. You have these guys that have these electric smiles again, but even though they have these electric smiles, their style of play was permeated by toughness. It was permeated by grit. It was permeated by determination. So actually, even though these players were so gifted, and both of them were, they actually, in terms of their approach, were very blue collar like, and they represented blue collar cities to the utmost in Detroit and Chicago, respectively. So something else that really united these players. And then when you talk about that branding piece also, the other thing is when you have a player that is great, Another thing that the league, the teams, etc., another thing that they can use to market, to leverage, and make money for everybody is if this player and his approach and his disposition sort of resonates with the disposition and the approach of the city. So Magic, with his personality, resonated with LA. And Bird, with his personality, resonated with Boston. And then you have the same thing with Michael in Chicago and Isiah in Detroit. So they both represented blue collar places as well. And they had blue collar elements to their game and their approach to the game, even though they were both these super skilled showmen of the game that had great smiles also. So then when you start looking at that influence that they had, and you talk about the fear and intimidation, they both were responsible for being mentors and helping two players that are all-time greats also from small cities, small colleges that kind of didn't understand the business element of basketball. Michael was responsible for socializing to a certain extent, Scotty, and then you had Detroit and you had Isiah responsible for the socialization to a certain extent of a Dennis Rodman. So they both shared that responsibility also, and they knew that they had to socialize Dennis Rodman and Scottie Pippen respectively if they both, Isiah and Michael, wanted to reach those championship aspirations that they both had. So they also had that in common as well. And then one of the other things from a playing perspective that they share when you look at them is when you go back to their college careers, they both played at legendary college programs that were operated and operated and ran by coaches that relied on blue collar approach, fundamentals. So you have these superhuman talents in Isiah and Michael that are all about expression, and their artistry on the floor is about their personal expression. And they played for coaches that were all about the team and help them to learn how to bring those immense individual talents and make them part of the team concept. They both shared that when they were in college. So to a certain extent, you have these great artists on the basketball floor in the case of a Michael Jordan and an Isiah Thomas, and they had to probably temper their games a little bit to be successful, to play for the coaches, Dean Smith at North Carolina and Bobby Knight at Indiana, to have that success and help those teams win the championships that they won. Those two players, Michael and Isiah, certainly had to temper their games a little bit to be successful in the team concept, and it helped them to be able to convey their success and their individual talents to the rest of their team and have a little bit of a communal approach as well. So there's something else that I felt like that they have in common, and they both had to overcome their nemesis on their way to winning titles and overcome their rival team on the way to winning titles. Isiah had a couple of mishaps and shortcomings in the Pistons against the Boston Celtics in the playoffs. And they had to overcome the Celtics on the way to winning their title, their two titles. And then, of course, Michael had to overcome the Pistons and the challenge that they brought on his way to his championships as well. So these players, with them being fiercely competitive, they actually share a lot of things that we should probably talk more about. They're probably a lot more alike than they are different. But I know the focusing on the differences sort of brings ratings. People love the controversy. If you make it in terms of 90s music, this is an East Coast, West Coast beef, all of those things that people love to see that brings attention to the game. And so I want to talk a little bit before I let you go, Hoop Fam, about the Pistons not shaking hands and acknowledging that the Bulls had overcome them and beat them. So I personally don't have a problem with the Pistons not shaking hands with the Bulls. I don't have a problem with that. The only thing that I can find fault with Isiah Thomas and the Pistons about is they walked off the floor with 7.9 seconds left on the clock. And that was disrespectful. But the fact that they didn't shake hands, that doesn't really bother me. And it doesn't bother me for a number of reasons. Because number one, even in today's game, you will see players and players are certainly more friendly now than they used to be in that era. And I played in that era. But when you look now, when players are actually more friendly and they're friendlier now than they were then. Sometimes players will come in half court and they'll pray together. Sometimes players on opposing teams will come and they will they'll dap each other up, and they'll give each other a man hug, whatever the case may be. But sometimes you see players literally walk off the floor and don't acknowledge the other team. And we don't have an issue with that. So I personally don't have a problem with players not shaking hands. And people will also say, well, that doesn't set a good example. Well, you know what really doesn't set a good example? When you have teams actually beating players up like they did during that era when we're playing basketball, which is why the NBA sort of instituted the rule changes that they have now to clean that up, because they were more concerned about making this a fan-friendly game and setting the right examples. But back then, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on that, and the game was played differently. So to expect someone to shake hands after literally they've gone through a 15-round fight is a little bit, that's asking a lot. And especially when you start looking at basketball players, because this is not a collision sport. It's a contact sport. It's not a collision sport. It's not like boxing or MMA, where sometimes you will see people pulverize each other, and that's the nature of the game. They are in the hurt business, and then they shake hands after the fight. Basketball is different. Your personality is different. Your socialization is different. And so when you look at Michael Jordan and some of the fervor that he has toward the Bulls, they could have almost taken his career with some of the plays that they made. And so to expect him to go and want to shake hands and be friendly with him after they could have changed, they could have negatively impacted his career. And we may not have the brand of Air Jordan if he were to get hurt. So to expect this to be all peachy keen and everything is all good, I think that's asking a lot. And then one of the last things I'll say about Isiah before I let you go, Hoop Fam, is when you look at Isiah Thomas, and I'm saying this as a point guard, what you have to do to be able to dominate at the level at which he dominated, and he didn't have the size to impose his will on the game, when you look at what he had to do to be a dominant player, to ask him to be a choir boy is probably asking too much. Because again, I can say this as a point guard, especially playing in that era, the amount of physical abuse that you take when you are a focal point of your team and you don't have the size to strike back, you don't have the size to bomb first and impose your will, the amount of abuse that you take and how you are dependent on your teammates, your bigger teammates, to actually stand up for you it goes underrepresented. So again, shout out to Isiah Thomas. Should certainly should be mentioned. And I certainly think that if Jordan and Isiah, when you start looking at these players, just like the late great Kobe Bryant and Shaquille O'Neal had a session and they filmed it and they had a reconciliation, and Magic had a reconciliation with Isiah on TV. It would be great to see Isiah and Michael have a reconciliation, because I think it'd be great for the fans, again, because we're taking these two greats and we're talking about their beef so much, and we are not recognizing and appreciating the greatness of each player. And, to bring it sort of current, especially now with Michael in The Last Dance and how it relates to LeBron. And I don't want to sound like I'm neutral and scared to take a side, but it's created this argument as to who is the better player, Michael or LeBron, and people get in their camps and they're firmly entrenched and it becomes personal. And if you like one, you can't like the other one. And I just feel like as fans, we spend so much energy engaged in that. And what we should be looking at are the superlatives that unite these players and appreciate the greatness and stop spending so much time being divisive and talking about if you like this guy, you can't appreciate the other one and vice versa. So again, Hoop Fam, this was impromptu. Thank you for joining. Hope everybody got some insight on this. Certainly wanted to share my views. Very excited. Thank you again. Look forward to seeing you all. Stay healthy, stay safe.